Yeah, so I'm 55, but if I go back 50 years, I can remember playing with the kids, my friends next door. And all I thought of my friends next door was they're just other kids. I didn't see them as girl or boy. And the kind of things we did together weren't particularly stereotypical girl or boyish. I climbed trees with the girl next door. I played football with the girl on the other side. And I remember making rose petal perfume with one further up the road. I also played other games with two boys further down the street, but I didn't really see them as boy girl. I just saw them as boring versus interesting, more senses of the word. And certainly the boys were less interesting than the girls. And at that age, it's not a sexual thing, it's a tribal thing. It's the girls were more communicative, more willing to talk emotions and feelings perhaps, but also actually quite tomboyish and willing to do all things without judging what those things were. But I remember early in kind of infant and junior school, the first time someone said, okay, boys sit here and girls sit here, or the boys are going outside to play football and the girls are going outside to play netball. That was the first time I realized there was a gender division between the sheep and the goats, so to speak. And I thought, well, I know I'm meant to go and be with the boys, but all my friends are the girls and all the things I do is with the girls and all my conversations with the girls, and I don't really fit with the boys. But I persisted because I kind of biologically, even at that age, knew, okay, so I am a boy, I'll go with the boys. But they did not feel like my tribe. And that was the only way to describe it, really. It was more of a social belonging, if that made any sense of the word. And that carried on. It wasn't until about 9 or 10 that I began to think, what is this? How do I feel? When you start to get those feelings of who are your tribe and how do you fit psychologically with the people around you. And at 11, for the sake of education, I chose to go to an all-boys school, which should have kind of firmly made the decision that I'm a boy with the boys and all the rest of it. But I had a non-stereotypical journey because I didn't have a male puberty till 18/19. So that meant I didn't have testosterone firing during my teens. I didn't compete at all in any of the men's sports properly. I hated being in the rugby showers with all the boys because I was the littlest kid. And I was the littlest kid in my year and the year below that, effectively. So I never fitted either physically, psychologically, or emotionally or socially with the boys. That didn't automatically make me think I'm a girl, but that's certainly how society made it feel, that there were only two choices.
And when did you decide that you were transgender and you wanted to start a journey of changing things in your life?
Well, in my 20s, I kind of by choice got into quite fundamentalist, charismatic Christianity, which is a very good way of trying to suppress your identity. And then to top that, I decided to marry a psychiatrist. And the combination of those two things, I thought was a very good way of keeping Pandora firmly in the box and the genie back in the bottle.
With the heavy weight on top of that box.
Oh yeah. And then marriage and then being evangelical, marriage is for life. You cannot escape. So I went into heterosexual marriage, buried the transgender demon as deep as possible, and also did voluntarily go to conversion therapy and deliverance and heavy duty prayer to try and get rid of these feelings. So I went through that kind of Christian ministry process to try and get rid of these, what I thought of as skeletons that I had to get out. So I got my skeletons out of the closet before I went into the closet, assuming they'd gone. They hadn't gone. I lied my head off, essentially, because I hated what was happening to me. It became oppressive, the heavy duty, you have to repent of this. We're going to keep praying for you till this demon of transgender or whatever it is goes. And I just buried it as deep as I could, but it burst out with a vengeance 10, 12 years later.
Because you can't completely just suppress these things, can you? They don't just go away.
And it wasn't for lack of freedom amongst my parents. My parents were incredibly, accepting and open-minded and my mum, particularly having grown up in a household where she was treated less equally than her brother, wanted to ensure that me and my sister were treated absolutely equally. So me and my sister don't really have any differences offered to us. We had great freedoms and we're great friends. But I never came out as transgender, shall we say. I was outed age 39. To some extent, understandably, I would say, by my wife, who discovered pictures of me cross-dressed on my computer. She came home from work and she said, well, you didn't password protect it, so you clearly wanted me to find them. I wouldn't say that.
And do you think you did want her to find them?
I didn't know. I didn't want her to find them. I was still cross-dressing in secret in it, and I felt shame around it because I was still Christian and all these things. I felt shame, I felt guilt, and I felt I don't know how to stop this. I don't know how to get rid of this. But when she confronted me over it, I said, well, actually, I've felt these things, for 30 plus years, and I think the only way to get rid of them is to go through them and hopefully out the other side. And I actually thought of being trans at that point as something I could get rid of by finally bringing it into the light, because keeping it in the dark hadn't worked. And she said, well, that wasn't something she could accept. It was a case of, if I wanted to do that, we'd have to get divorced. And being evangelical Christians, that felt like just as much of a sin as being transgender was. And I was having to choose between two sins, it felt like at the time. So we did get divorced. But I went into therapy, went to see a psychiatrist. I went to see a therapist and said, can you stop me being trans? I went to see a psychiatrist, and he said, oh, I've known you were trans for 7 years. I said, how do you know that? He said, because you were so masculine. I said, well, that doesn't make sense. He said, no, your masculinity was like a mask. It was like you were trying too hard to be male. And I was overcompensating. And the way I express myself now, I don't compensate at all. I'm just me. I don't try to be female. I don't try to be male. I just happily be who I am, whatever that is, whatever box or label fits around that. But certainly my psychiatrist eventually described me as the most reluctant transsexual he'd ever met. And I headed off to California and did sex and body workshops to try and get rid of it as well. I made a decision I would not change my body until I could accept it.
And so, Katy, how long a process was it for you from when your wife found those pictures and you started to go and talk to people about this? How long was that process from when you, I suppose, accepted yourself, made peace with it, and decided to do a physical transition?
10 years. For multiple reasons. One, as I said, I was reluctant. I tried everything else first. So I really am the opposite of any stereotype of a trans person who walks into a psychiatrist's office and says, give me a vagina now, sort of thing. I said, what can I do to avoid this? To everyone I met, psychologists. After marrying a psychiatrist, going through divorce, I then spent 5 or 6 years dating therapists, not just to get it on the cheap, but because I find the human mind, fascinating, and I think they found mine fascinating as well, particularly since I was so confused by my own journey, but willing to explore it openly, having previously explored it secretly. And I made a decision from the age of 39, never again. Everything will always be open, no more secrets. I will explore everything externally and visibly and transparently, literally. But it was around aged, I think 43, that I started taking hormones. And that's for the first time that it felt like putting the right fuel in the engine. And it actually made sense, but surgery wasn't until I was 49.
So when you started taking the hormones, did you instantly feel happier? Did it feel that made a big difference straight away?
Well, it made me cry a lot to start with, because taking estrogen gives you moody cycles. But no, it did. It made me incredibly happy. The well-being was, I thought, wow, it suddenly made sense. It was like prior to taking hormones, I had a French head and a German body. After taking hormones, everyone was Italian and we were all happily getting on together. Or it felt like food. Yeah, definitely around food. Or it felt like finally putting, unleaded in the diesel car, which had previously been messing up the engine, or something like that. But it certainly made sense. And also the first thing they do before you get hormones, you have to jump through a bunch of hoops anyway, psychiatric assessments, psychological assessments, 2 years, actually, and interestingly, you have to live 2 years self-ID before you could get the hormones. So actually self-ID already existed. And I had to go through that process. And also a blood test. And the blood test showed that my testosterone was minuscule, way below the minimum level even for a man. So actually it made total sense at that point, even biologically or scientifically, that I didn't feel or was typically masculine, certainly at an endocrine level. And that made a lot of sense and explained why I didn't get a puberty till 18, 19, about 4 years late.
And so, Katy, when did you decide to have surgery, and what was the effect of that?
Well, again, surgery. I thought, okay, hormones, they're great. Let's see how long I can get away with not having surgery. At a psychological basis, not because I wanted to maintain male genitalia and have a sex life that had ceased anyway. Pretty much, I would say I am regard myself and am asexual. Sex has got nothing to do with my life in that sense at all. So for me, it wasn't anything about the sexuality side, but it was, you know, a dysfunctional organ even prior to taking estrogen, and taking estrogen made it more dysfunctional. But I still didn't want to physically change my body with invasive surgery rather than kind of additive hormones. So hormones, yeah, they develop breasts. They do change your mood somewhat. I'm also bipolar, and and hormones actually made my bipolar more exaggerated because it's got some linkage to estrogen. So I tried to delay having the surgery as long as possible, but I gave myself this kind of ultimatum that if I couldn't make up my mind by 50, I'd just get on with it anyway. Also, if I couldn't get rid of the thoughts in my head. And the estrogen certainly calmed me, certainly eased some of it, but it didn't take it all away. I still felt I was living within two worlds. And eventually I said, okay, I'm going to sign up for it on the basis that it takes 5 or 6 years to get it on the NHS, which is plenty of time to decide. And then about 3 or 4 years into that, I got rung up by the NHS one day to say, there's such a massive backlog. We've obtained some extra slots at a private hospital, actually using identical surgeons, but on their days off, costing exactly the same on the internal market for the NHS, and said, we've actually got a slot for surgery for you. It's in 6 weeks. I said, okay, I kind of planned at least 2 more years to equivocate over this. Well, they said, well, this slot goes tomorrow. You have 24 hours to decide. So, and I would say at the time I was about 80-20 in favor of having surgery. And some days it was 60-40. It was always above 50%, but it was never 100% at all.
Yeah.
And then I just thought, then I asked them some very critical questions, such as, what's the food like at the hospital?
Well, now that you're Italian, and now that you're on your way to be Italian, you have to ask about the
and is there a wine list? Because they said it was a private hospital. And I thought, okay, I'm going to sign up for it. And then even on the gurney, minutes before surgery, I literally, the surgeon only did 3 surgeries on a Saturday, and I was warned to make sure I had the middle one. The first one, he hasn't had enough coffee for, and the third one he rushes because he's got to get off to go and play golf. The middle one is the best outcome, they say.
That's good.
And I had the middle one, but I was lying on the gurney thinking, do I want to get off the gurney and run right now?
And literally. So obviously you had the operation, and are you glad that you did? Were you how did you feel afterwards?
That's 6 years ago, and I've not had a single day of regret. So in hindsight, Captain Hindsight comes to the table, and I would say I'm 100% certain I should have had the op, but even if I was never certain beforehand, and now having had the op at age 49 and being 55, I wish I'd had it 30 years ago. And
so do you now feel, having gone through a very, very long journey, as you said earlier, you knew when you were, a child that things didn't feel quite right. Do you wish that you could have made this change in your life earlier?
Absolutely, but I do think there are risks around making those decisions early, and I wouldn't be me had I not been through the marriage to the psychiatrist, the Christian years, and all these other things, and all the years of searching and doubting and checking whether it was the right thing to do. For me, being trans was a last resort. It would be great to live in a society where it's a first resort, but where you actually can guarantee to know your own mind and how your mind's going to change. I don't know. So yes, I would have loved to have done this earlier, but I can only say absolutely that would have been a safe thing to do in hindsight.
And Katy, would you say now that you are much, much happier as a human being?
Yeah, I'm 100% happy as a human being. I have day-to-day worries like everyone else, including energy prices and things like that. But actually, that part of my life, the gender side, is gone. It really did cure gender dysphoria for me. It may not cure everyone. There may be people for whom it didn't work and who detransition, and that's got to be right for them as well. But for me, I cannot believe that a psychiatric condition was cured by a surgical outcome plus the endocrine medicine in terms of the hormones. I cannot believe that all of those thoughts went. It's like having a lobotomy on my brain, but the lobotomy was between my legs instead.
Well, listen, you're listening to Aisha Hazarika. Welcome back. I'm speaking with trans activist and trans speaker, Katy Jon Went. Now, Katy, we have discussed your life story. What was your reaction to the news last week about Jamie Wallace, the Conservative MP for Bridgend, who came out as transgender? It's quite a big moment because we haven't had an openly transgender member of Parliament. Do you think this will be a big turning point?
Well, I know it's going to upset Eddie Izzard because Eddie wanted to be the first transgender MP. No, it's interesting because you get some people even immediately within the trans community saying wrong kind of trans, wrong kind of politics, someone holding on to their existing pronouns because they're only just beginning to navigate this journey. And they're saying, look, they're basically what they've said is I have gender dysphoria. I think I'm trans. And I'm at the beginning of my journey, and it's not typical to navigate that in the public eye. So that much is brave, but it is putting a head above the parapet. I don't think we can form many opinions about it at all at the moment because they very much are at the beginning of a journey. But it will add fuel to the fire in some places. So I can see it being torn apart. So I would suggest that most people just leave that person up to their own privacy and to go back into privacy to pursue it and navigate it, on their own terms, and with medics, as they said, they are really. It shouldn't be, up in the political gaze, so to speak, but inevitably it is.
Yeah.
And I can see Peter Tatchell's commented on it as well already and things. So,
and it is very much in the political gaze. It's very much in the media spotlight. Transgender issues have become a real flashpoint in the culture wars. There was also this week, I mean, you've probably picked up on this as well, but it does seem there's been a sort of kind of peak level of hysteria around some of the media coverage. Lots of people being asked about penises, and I mean, I felt it all got a bit brass eye. I mean, Boris Johnson also came in for a bit of criticism. He made a joke saying, "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," or as Keir Starmer would put it, people who are assigned female at birth. Keir Starmer got in a bit of a flummox when he was asked by Nick Ferrari if a woman could have a penis. What do you think about how these debates are being framed at the moment? And by the way, were you offended by Boris Johnson's joke?
I can see why people were offended by it. I personally wasn't in that sense. I've done comedy, I find things funny, and I can find things funny that I shouldn't find funny as well. And I can understand why people can get hurt by them. I think it's a flippant way to deal with what is actually incredibly sensitive and volatile issue. So I don't think it helps. It doesn't help the debate. I think sometimes we need to take the heat out of the debate and put some humor into it, but I don't think Boris is perhaps the best person to be doing that.
And Katy, what do you think about, I mean, you and I have talked about this, that, I mean, the debate around these issues has become so heated. What role do you think the media play in that? And how do we try and have better conversations around these issues? Because there are strong emotions on both sides. We've just heard very moving, powerful testimony about your own life story. I know many feminists who are absolutely passionate about women's rights. I wrote the Equality Act. We put into law single-sex spaces. So there's a lot of good faith arguments on both sides, but they are clashing with this absolute vitriol. How do we try and navigate this, Katy?
Well, one of the ways is to put the human story out there. And I think that means that trans people need to hear the human stories of women who are worried about single-sex spaces, women who've been through abuse and sexual violence, and trans people need to listen to those stories. But it's also not denying that trans people can't be similar victims of exactly the same issues, typically male violence against women and girls and trans. But for example, 2 doors up from me lives my neighbor, Linda Bellos, and we get on very well. We still talk about all these things. Linda very much was a friend and neighbor and supported me with her former wife through my surgery.
Just explain to our listeners who Linda Bellos is.
Yeah, Linda is a former London Council leader, one of the co-founders of Black History Month, and has been investigated by the police as a gender critical woman who said and allegedly bad things about trans people and all the things like that. So,
okay.
So it's a spicy, it would be a spicy conversation people would imagine that we have, but we don't. We have a humane conversation because we know each other. and I have got to know people on either sides of the so-called fence. So I'm happy to sit down and have a conversation. And as Julie Bindel and I are happy to do that. We've decided we will do that. And she won't be worried about me saying that because we've said it publicly. And so I think if you get to know the other person, you can navigate a conversation because you recognize the other person is human, has feelings, has history. And we need to find a way to get to the empathy for both sides. And then we can have a more empathic conversation.
It's very difficult to just do that on social media, because social media is the place where everyone has to be in a tribe, and there's a lot of polarization. Some of it is performative, some of it, in the heat of the moment, people say very hurtful things. Where do we have these conversations, Katy? I mean, you and I have had a very
over food. No, seriously, I'm not disputing. I think over food, Julie and I have agreed to go for a drink. We need to kind of normalize them in such a way instead of setting them up.
Where do you think the role is? Because you can only have so many lunches with people, and we do need bigger conversations through politics and through the press as well. How do you think we have those better conversations? Because a lot of politicians, particularly on the left, are very frightened to get into this debate because it has become so toxic.
Yeah, and I think a lot of moderate voices are frightened because even if they say something, even moderately, then either side either rejects them or claims them, and everyone wants to polarize. What we need to do is to find a way to have non-polarizing conversations and to be allowed to say things that may not toe the so-called party line on either side. And it needs to be effectively the same as politics. We need to have some cross-party consensus on how to handle and navigate sex and gender in society, how to handle safety and things in society. Find what are the common goals. Everyone is against violence. Everyone is for safety. So then how do we navigate those conversations? I live in Norwich, and we hold in our local, one of our local arts centres and theatres and things occasionally something called a respectful conversation. And what I do for that is I get 4 or 5 speakers, we get them on stage, we discuss a topic like gender, but we set up the stage with sofas and with coffee tables and with flowers and pints and magazines to normalize it, to make it look like someone's front room or you're down the pub.
So, I mean, you're a real expert in sort of facilitating these, conversations. But what do you think about, for example, the gotcha question that we seem to be in a sort of never-ending loop in? I mean, how helpful or unhelpful are those types of, big viral moments?
I think one of the best ways to handle some of the gotcha questions is to answer it with a surprise. And so very often if someone asks me a gotcha question, I will say yes. Women do have vaginas, as if it's something you're not allowed to say anymore. And I think more trans people need to say the unsayable to actually get some of the politicians off the hook of feeling like they can't say it. It's ludicrous that we can't describe body parts, that we can't describe what is normal or regular or typical biology. There are exceptions to all of those rules. And obviously people who transition end up with neo-vaginas, and there is an actual medical terminology to describe the construction of one as opposed to being born with one. So if people are really worried, they can use actual accurate vocabulary. It's like giving children all the euphemisms for this language. We're now euphemistically running around like parents scared their kids can't say a certain word. And we are all scared to say those words. And we need to be willing to say it. And people, again, need to break rank on this, because it's this keeping the kind of the party line on it, having the kind of what I call the purity litmus test of, who has a penis and can you say trans women are women type thing. And it's, which is the line you sit on.
I think and those, very ironically sort of binary slogany statements feel like they're distorting what should be a complicated, warm, common sense, but compassionate discussion in the middle. And look, we're running out of time, Katy, but I just wanted to pick up on one experience you had spoken about yourself, which is very much in the news, and that is about conversion therapy. There was lots of U-turns in the last sort of 24 hours about conversion therapy. You've been through it. What's your reaction to these U-turns?
What my dilemma is the fact that it's the U-turn of the U-turn is that gay conversion therapy will now be banned, but trans won't be touched. And the dilemma with that is, sex and gender and sexuality are not 100% discrete areas. It's like a Venn diagram with all three slightly overlapping. We aren't these discrete things. We live intersectional lives around those areas. And increasingly young people are actually, opting out of strict heterosexuality or gayness and actually saying, I'm pansexual, or I don't care about the gender of my partner. And I think we need to acknowledge that actually any kind of therapy that stops you being you is a bad call. But equally, any kind of bad law that tries to ban either kind of therapy that also stops supportive, explorative therapy is also bad law. So I think the law needs to be well considered, but should have included a degree of ban on the transgender conversion therapy as well.
And Katy, in the final few minutes we have, the issue of pronouns is one that a lot of people get in a bit of a tiz about. Some people for sort of bad reasons, other people because they don't want to offend people. How did you approach your pronouns? How do you navigate that?
With humor personally, but that's partly because if you go around taking offense at everything, everyone ends up on the back foot and walking on eggshells around you, and that's not comfortable for anyone. I think, yes, you should respect pronouns, but at the same time, the person you're asking to respect your pronouns about, you've given them 1 minute warning to get used to it. You've had, years in the closet and then coming out and getting used to it. So you've lived it. And giving people no time at all to play catch up and to get it right, and then making them wrong if they don't, is not fair either. My personal pronouns are they, she, he in that order. He, because I know I've got a masculine voice, and that's going to confuse people, particularly on radio or on the phone. She, I love being called she, but I don't necessarily go around claiming it, but I love it when people call me she, and it tends to be from accepting women, who are the majority of women that I encounter. And they, I just find as accurate. And I don't find it hugely problematic in the English language. If I say, my sister went to the shop yesterday and bought a dress, they bought a red one, everyone knows who I'm talking about. And also pronouns are generally speaking spoken about behind your back. So you don't really know what's being said about you, or you're written about in the third person. And we all remember the Oscar Wilde line that the next worst thing to being talked about behind your back is not being talked about behind your back. But it's a difficult one, but yeah.
Listen, Katy, it's been such a pleasure speaking with you. You have shone a huge amount of light on your own story. I think we've all learnt a lot, and you've spoken a lot of common sense. Thank you so much for speaking to me on Times Radio.